right, we are live. Thank y'all so much for coming. So nice to see all ladies in the house for this wonderful walkthrough by KELLI SCOTT KELLEY. For those of us who are tuning in, we'll give them just a few minutes. They're letting folks know that we're live. In the meantime, please, Kelly, introduce yourself to us and give us a brief bio sketch.
Hello everyone. And I like the all lady crowd too. It's nice. So first I want to give a big thank you to Leslie Spillman and Amy Blackwell for giving me this opportunity. So thrilled to have my work in this space, and I think they've done a beautiful job with the way that they presented it. So I'm KELLI SCOTT KELLEY. I'm actually a native Louisianan. I grew up in Baton Rouge and left for 15 years, went to University of Massachusetts in Amherst for graduate school. Never thought I would return, lived in the Bay Area, in Oakland for a while, and then for many years in Houston where my career really got going, and then returned to eventually teach at LSU. I've been a professor there since 2000 in painting and drawing, and just glad to have this opportunity.
Cool. Thank you so much, Kelly. Well, let's get right to it. Your practice is so unique. So tell us a little bit about how you would describe your practice, of course, outside of the practice of teaching, which is so important.
It is. And it was really exciting to have a bunch of my students and colleagues come over for the opening last weekend, so that meant a lot to me. And being able to share, after many years of practicing as an artist, being able to share with young people back in my home state means a lot to me. So I think actually this is a good piece to start with, and the title of this show is On Emptiness. And I'm calling it On Emptiness because it's reflections, contemplations. I haven't figured it all out. And emptiness could refer to this kind of nihilistic idea of nothingness, which I think is easy these days for us to slip into that with a lot of really heavy stuff going on in the world. And a lot of this work was being conceived of through COVID. This work is mostly 2022 and 23, so it's all really recent in this room anyway. And the other idea, so emptiness could be nothing. The other idea of emptiness could be everything. This idea that nothing exists independently of everything else. So, for example, a piece of paper. That piece of paper doesn't exist without the place it was made, the people who made it, the tree that was cut down, the person who cut down the tree, the parents who birthed the people who cut down the tree, the sun, the rain. And so then when you ask yourself, what is a piece of paper? It's all of those things. So that idea of emptiness, and so contemplating both ends of that. Another title that I contemplated was Alone Together. And I think this piece kind of exemplifies that. This piece is called Cactus. One of the main images is a cactus in the center. And these figures are all together but alone. I'm sure COVID influenced that a little bit. One thing I do want to say about this work that pertains to all of them is you'll see music paper, sheet music paper in the background. My mother's a pianist, and she was an organist for 45 years at her church, and she recently gifted me that paper. And for many years I've been working on surfaces that have meaning to me. So old linens, I've worked on my son's school papers from when they were a child, and in this case, the musical instrument paper actually is throughout all of the work. In all of the work, almost all of the figures and objects in the 2022-23 works were first drawn on music paper like this, in this piece called Longing, and cut out. And then it was also kind of reminiscent of my childhood playing with paper dolls, because then I had these cut out figures that I was moving around. And then a note about my process. the ideas behind the work emerge as I'm working on them. I try as much as possible to get out of the way and to allow, to soak in images, to take pictures, to sketch, to write, to read, and then allow things to arise without having a clear understanding, because I feel like that stops it. And so that's also goes back to the title, On Emptiness. So these contemplations, there's not always exact meanings for the work. These images arise. I try to just trust and go for it, and then over time I start to understand different things that they might mean, or I also will be inspired by something someone else says about the work that then brings another layer of meaning to the work.
Nice.
So one of the things I've been working with for years are repurposed vintage linens. And that started around 2010. I was trying to find ways of making my work, actually it goes back even a few years before that, trying to find ways of making my work that didn't always rely on new materials, really feeling the heaviness of adding new things to the planet. And then how do I grapple with that? Because I don't feel like I can function without making. And so instead of buying canvas that I often sewed together and put patterns on, I started going to thrift stores, getting linens and bed sheets and clothes and cutting them apart. And then around 2010, a friend of mine saw that I was experimenting and said, would you like to have my grandmother's old linens that are falling apart in the attic? And it was like this light bulb going off, because it added this layer of women's work, domesticity. They come with this history that's very resonant that I respond to. There's like breadcrumbs based on, so for example, in this one, some of the embroidery that then informs the composition. And this piece is called Progress. And another important thing about this work is I did 2 one-month residencies in Wyoming, in 2021 at UCross, and in 2022 at Gentel, both in Northwest Wyoming, very remote, really inspiring. There with a small group of other creative people, embedded in this powerful landscape and just digging inside and going out into the landscape. And so I was going out doing plein air, little watercolors and drawings. And at UCross, there's this grove of aspen trees that had little cages around them. And the cages were to keep deer from eating them, but it just had this profound effect on me of feeling like they were caged and thinking about, well, on one hand, these people were trying to grow new ones, but then there's this cage, and so then just this irony of that. There were also these antiquities that were in a lot of the buildings on the campus that I made drawings and took photographs of, and that's where this piece emerged. And the aspen trees, have these eyes, and they really are looking at you. And so that's where this piece came from. So I was doing all of these studies, and I had this linen, and I started looking at my studies and then went, oh. And then really, it's like the image emerged from the fabric, becoming in a collaborative relationship with the original person who made the fabric and responding to what was already there. So that's an example of that.
Nice.
So let's see.
One thing I noticed about this work, having shown your work for some years now, is how colorful it is. And I know that I actually just happened to catch you in a rather desaturated moment in your practice, and because when I asked you about it before, you said you do frequently work with color, but I'm just curious about this sort of return to this really intense color that I'm seeing in the work.
Yeah, so maybe we can go over and look at this one when we're talking about color. This one is called Whole, and there's a hole in the floor. So that's where the title came from. I love color, and one of the things that you're talking about when we first started working together, I was coming off of my Acacia and the Swamp Monster work, and there are books available here. So that was like a 10-year project that was a fairy tale that I wrote that was loosely autobiographical. My work has always been narrative, and I thought, what if I started with a narrative text, and then I ended up writing it. And for that work, it's when I first started working on the old linens, and so I was really responding to the subtlety of the colors there, and I wanted it to feel like the images magically emerged from the fabric. So it was very transparent layers of glazes, and so there is color in that work, but it's more nuanced, and there's a lot of tonal work, and so it's more subtle. And for this work, I started bringing back in more patterned fabrics, and responding partly to those fabrics. This was an old curtain that someone gave me. So many of the linens are things that people give to me. So they have all of this resonant meaning for me, all kinds of layers. And when I was working on this one, I tried to, just like I said, be intuitive and trust what comes up. And so I painted this character, this kind of character that feels like he's just given up, he's exhausted, slumped over this table. And I was doing this pink underpainting, because many of them have underpainting that then I paint over, and you might see little bits of the color underneath. And I went, no, I think he's gonna stay pink, So just, again, trusting and not just having this plan, but really trying to be present with what happens along the way. And this was a great example of that. A note about the imagery in the work. So obviously there's lots of figures and creatures in the work, and I use myself and I use people that I know to model for me. And so it might be that I ask someone that I have in mind, and I have particular poses I want. They'll come to the studio, I take pictures. I love, direct observation, but this isn't about that. It's, I just capture pictures that I need that then I'm gonna manipulate. But then sometimes I'll also get several people together and do a photo shoot. And for a lot of the work in this show, when I did a photo shoot with 5 people about a year ago, and I brought with me a bunch of pictures I gathered from out in the news, the world, for the last year. And so this would have been 2020 that I was gathering images from. And so there's a lot of kind of dark stuff. And while they were modeling, I was projecting those pictures and saying, oh, why don't we do this, why don't we do that? And so kind of gathering from what's been out there in the world, and then having people do that, and then played around with those pictures in my studio for a long time, and pulled one figure from this picture, another one from there, and that's how a lot of the figures in the most recent work came up for me. So this one is one like that. So this one is called Wilderness, and you see a male figure that's reclining. Although I think the figure's kind of androgynous, but for me it's a male figure, and you don't know whether he's sleeping, he's just like exhausted and can't get up, or he's dead, but he's struggling, and his body is a flowered pattern, and then in this little window or picture on the wall, there's a lion that has the same pattern that's looking out into an empty expanse. And so obviously they're connected. And then there are these, and then, thinking about a lion, and there's other lion imagery in this work, is represents courage and bravery. Also, there are cases in the work where there are females with lion heads, and so that are male, and so playing around with gender neutrality the male having embodiment of the female having embodiment of the male. And so in this case, there's the lion, this representation of male bravery and courage looking out into this blank, unknown expanse. And then you have them covered with this flowered pattern, which is kind of feminine. So again, playing with that, pairing the masculine and the feminine. And then these other figures are looking on. I think of them as maybe engaged in some sort of ritual, either ritual or mourning, or trying to conjure something that's going to help this reclining figure. So those are kind of some things that I was thinking about.
How did this is the first work I've seen, and this might not be the first time you've done this, but this is the first work I've shown of yours, we've shown of yours, that's mounted on canvas in this way. Mm-hmm. And I think it's such a smart solution to kind of making the work easier to hang and to place. So just wondered if you could talk about kind of the transition to that, or how long you've been doing that, or if it's new.
So for a long time, I talked about working on these old found linens. I was also just pinning them directly on the wall, and often sewing little hanging devices, and I really wanted them to be like they are in the studio, where you could get up close to them and having a really direct experience. But I started thinking about, well, what happens if I contain them a little bit? Because there is this expansive feeling that might be uncomfortable for some people, and just what would happen. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see in this show, all of the works, with the exception of the migrations room, which I'll talk about later, are in frames, so they're a little bit more contained within little, I think it makes them kind of precious too, in little boxes. And then I thought, well, what if I do it also on stretch canvases? So putting it back into a square format. But then I decided to carry the fabrics around the edges, bringing back this feeling of their objectness. And that's something that I also like about the linens right on the wall. You feel the objectness of them. So I wouldn't go so far as to say they're sculptural, but my MFA shifted towards sculpture. So I have been working with objects for a long time. And so then wrapping them, I think they still have that quality, even though they're now in a little bit more of a rigid, controlled kind of surface.
Nice. What are your, I know you have favorites. Mm-hmm. Could you share with us what your favorites are?
That's like asking me to picture your baby. So actually, let's talk about this one.
I love the dog in this one.
This one is called Cosmos. And like I mentioned in that last one, this one has one of those lion characters. There's another one in a smaller room that's called Mother, which is a self-portrait. And so I think of this lion character as kind of an embodiment of me, and kind of a witness. And I think in this case, she's bearing witness. I'm a Leo. And then the constellation out the window is Leo. And so just some of those little things. And I really love how this figure is lost in contemplation, is in this other place, similar to the other reclining figure, that he's there but not there. And then the blue of the figure relates to the blue in the window. And this is one that went through a lot of changes while I was making it, cutting things apart, putting it back together in a new way, just the linens. And so there's often, once I get settled on the image, because I want to keep the integrity of the fabrics, I don't do a whole lot of changes, but just the structure of this one went through a lot of changes before it settled. And so I kind of battled with it, and so then I have just this kind of closer relationship to it because we had that struggle.
Nice. We can go into the other room too, because there's some new things in this room as well. And this is the piece you were talking about. Yeah. It's kind of a self-portrait, right?
This one's called Mother, and this is one that I made while I was in residence this summer. And I went into the room that I was assigned, my bedroom, and I also had an amazing studio at Gentel. And there were these, in my bedroom, these 2 walls of windows with these red curtains. So first I walked in and went, oh, it's the David Lynch room. And I'm a huge David Lynch fan, so it's just like, this is great. And I had brought a tripod with me, knowing that I wanted to take some pictures of myself to use in the work. And so I knew I had to stage myself there. So that this chair was there. And then this old tea towel, which had an embroidery of these kittens on it, was just like, oh, just one of those things where these things just fall into place, you know, and it just feels like this was meant to happen. So that was a really special one for me. Let's see, maybe this one I'll look at. This one was made the year before in residence at UCross, the same place where I made the one with the trees. This one's called Multitudes. And this is a good one to reference in terms of how the fabric then inspires what I do with it. So the embroidery that's on the fabric that was already there. And someone gave me this linen, so it had a special place in my heart. And I would walk to the studio mornings. It was like a half a mile walk or bike ride, and I would see like 50 deer. I'm not exaggerating. And these are meadowlarks, which are a bird that's common there. And then I used the flowers that were already in the embroidery that the deer is, you know, spewing out into the world. And so you can see how the fabric became a collaboration with me and inspired what it became.
I'm so curious about this piece with the ram and the wheelbarrow.
Yeah,
Is that you?
No, it's somebody that modeled for me, and actually she's in a couple of other ones. So this one is called Interbeing, and it's about this idea that, you know, it's a Buddhist concept of everything is connected to everything else. Everyone is connected to everyone else. And connects with that idea of emptiness, where that nothing is independent of anything else. These are, I took pictures of lichen in St. Francisville, on trees in St. Francisville, and they were these colors. So I knew I wanted to do something with that lichen. It was so magical, you know. So I had those pictures for a while, and then I had a model shot, and you know, just some different pictures that I ended up putting together to make it. And I ended up putting the same lichen on a deer, who is obviously, she's taking him, he looks like he's dead, and that the dead deer has the same lichen that was on the trees, but now the lichen that was on the trees becomes the cosmos. And so thinking about the micro and the macro, which is something that I'm very interested in, and you can see occurring in a lot of the work. The other thing about that you can see in this piece is that the striped fabric becomes super flat. And then if we look at this one over here, called this piece is called Longing. I'd like to play around with 2D and 3D, with the flatness of the plane, of the picture plane, and then the possibility for creating the illusion of 3D. And so in this example, the striped fabric goes over her foot, so then it suddenly becomes 3D. And it's something that I love to play around with. This was another one that I really struggled with for a long time, with getting the fabric to do what I wanted it to do. And these flowers were from an original pillow, part of an embroidery on a pillowcase that I kept cutting apart and changing. And then they became these flowers spewing from this man. You can see the music underneath the paint on this one. So it's another example. That's everywhere, but in cases you can see it. And then I ended up making a painting. Her head becomes this cosmos, or this world of that flower world that came from the original pillowcase embroidery. And when people saw this one at first, they said, oh, this one's about COVID. And I was like, oh, yeah, probably. But, you know, it's how those things just come up. You know, we don't always know why. So that's an example of, again, that playing with 2D, 3D. And this one actually is a really special one to me. This one is called Mirrored Galaxies. And the picture of the bonnet came from the Rural Life Museum in Baton Rouge. And for me, it represented a kind of oppression of women being hidden. But in this painting, I used it as her superpower. And the cosmos that's coming from her, that's an image from the new Webb Space Telescope. And there's another piece in here that has that too. And so this idea of her confinement is actually represents, you might think of it as her confinement, but there's really an infinite space and access to power that really resides within her. So those are some things I was thinking about. And you can see the same curtain in this one that's in the first piece that I talked about out there. And as you walk around, you can see some of the same fabrics being repeated in different pieces. And so that was really fun to do.
Nice. Should we go in the front?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I was really excited about doing this room, which is the migrations room. And so these works are from a body of work from 2020 and 2021, started the end of 2019 and moving in 2021. And I had been really depressed about, well, first of all, the pandemic was coming and everything. A lot of these were done during the pandemic. But thinking about climate change and global warming. And my work, I'm always pulling in what's happening in the world, even if it's in metaphorical ways or it's subtly hidden in there, it's always there. And I started seeing all these images of Greta Thunberg and just this power coming from this little waif-like, beautiful little person that ignited a movement. And so I started doing drawings of her, not sure what I was going to do. And then I ended up doing these drawings of her submerged in water, and it became this body of work. And so in a lot of the pieces, you see these characters, which I call nature characters, that are lumbering through, trudging through flooded waters. Now, of course, in Louisiana, we're very familiar with flooded waters. In Baton Rouge, there was the huge flood of 2016, of course, Katrina. So it's all around us all the time. Every time there's a big storm, it's a lot of fear, brings up a lot of fear. And then thinking about just refugees, climate refugees all over the world. And so I had this idea that I presented to Leslie and Amy, and I was thrilled that they let me paint this room gray. I wanted to create something a little bit more immersive, to be able to pin the works directly on the wall, and to have this room just be the migration works. So you've got these smaller works with the nature characters in the water, and then these bigger sort of anchor works where, in this case, one of the nature figures has found dry land. And I'm also thinking about our autonomy as human beings in connection with technology. And so here this is called offering. She's given an offering to this robot animal. And so this robot god. And so, you can bring to that what you think of it, but I think we all know that it's a little bit frightening, even though it's powerful having access to these technologies, but where our humanity is compromised when we rely so much on them. This was kind of what I think of the culminating piece of that series, and it's called The Last Supper. And you see the nature characters, and some of them that you see depicted in some of the images around the room. And they're all converging for a Last Supper. If you're familiar with Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, and I'm always referencing artists and art history, this is her Kali plate. And Kali is like a Hindu goddess of destruction and creation. And then there's some other plates from the Judy Chicago Dinner Party. And I also was looking at Last Supper images from art historical paintings. And in this image, the nature characters have all just said, screw it, we're out of here. And this little character represents humanity, and they're getting on a ship to go somewhere more hospitable. So that's kind of the culmination, but there's a lot of other pieces for this series, but it was nice to be able to put together a little immersive space for this work.
Nice. Thank you so much, Kelly. I know don't want to be the only one monopolizing you with questions. Does anybody else have any questions for Kelly?
I have a question about the comment. I like how you for the windows of the rocket ship, you put in instead of actually doing windows, it's something else like plates.
Yeah.
So I found that fascinating. It's really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm always trying to make connections, and like I said earlier at the beginning, just to be open to what comes up. And so unexpected things come up that then it's like, oh, that goes with that, So just enjoying that process and trusting it.
That's
Thank you.
really cool how you recycle the linen and make abstract kind of, I guess. If that's not fully, I don't really know, but it's just cool. How you reuse stuff to make your own, express your own art and your own beauty. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Tubby. So this is an example of one where this was like a little tablecloth. And so you have the whole linen that I cut apart a little bit, and had to mess with it a little bit, but it's the whole original linen, and then I added those little tabs at the top to use as the hangers.
And just a technical point for folks who can't see the work in person and experience it in person. These are linens, but the work that can hang by these little bitty nails is made rigid so that it actually isn't so floppy and flappy. Can you talk a little bit about how that's achieved?
Yeah, so like I said, I've been working on these old fabrics starting probably in about 2018. 2008. 10 years before. It's been a long time. And figured out how to do it over time. Still figuring it out. I get a linen, some of them are funky, some of them are torn, etc. So I basically am coating them in acrylic medium to make them stiff. And so they look like they're sized or starched, but it's really acrylic. And what that also does is it seals them. And I do that on both sides, and it makes it so that I can paint on them without the paint just, soaking into the surface. It is a little bit problematic for me because acrylics are the best way I've found to make this work, but it's a petroleum product. So I'm always grappling with, how do I make my work and not have so much of an impact? And then some of the works like this one, and often the larger ones, they're mounted to canvas because if not, they're just too wonky. And so now in this newest work, doing it on the stretched canvases, it's like, this is really not battling some of the innate qualities of the old linens. It's been kind of nice.
Yeah. Cool.
And then how would you suggest hanging these? Do you leave them as is?
Yeah.
Or,
Well, so these can go right on the wall. They're acrylic. Everything's covered. Even some of the older linens that might be a little fragile, they are completely coated inside acrylic. So they can go directly on the wall just like this. But this newer work, I've done the same kind of treatment, but I'm putting them in these sort of shadow box frames, so they can also be put into frames if people feel more comfortable with that, because they are more exposed. But and I think the frames kind of create a little precious box for them. Yeah. So I like seeing them both ways, actually.
We have a question from the stream. You talked about struggling with a work as an important factor in your attachment to it, almost like a relationship with a living being. Could you expand on that?
I had a lot of struggle through making this work. Just, I have trouble beating myself up sometimes, and so then just powering through anyway. And so it's this constant, feeling exhilarated and then feeling like, what am I doing? I don't know. What's it all about? this is dumb, and then, okay, I'm going to do it anyway. And so there's a lot of that through the making all the time, honestly. I'd like to get to a point where I don't do that, but I'm in my 60s now, I'm still doing it.
But maybe that's also an important part of the process,
Well, yeah,
you know?
Yeah, so-
Raging self-doubt seems to be like a really common factor of all my favorite, most successful artists. So I think you're probably in good company
yeah,
there.
I do, and that's why I don't mind sharing it, because I think, you know, those of us who make know what that's like.
Yeah.
And I do think then when you work through it and you are able to make something that you feel good about, then it is even more fulfilling having gone through that struggle. So yeah, that's a good question.
And do you think that the struggling with it makes it easier or harder to part with it as a commodity?
You know, I feel attached to them, you know, and so, and thinking about them in terms of them being commodities is always problematic for me, you know. It's like letting your child go so that they can flourish and be in the world. It's just like that, because I think if the work doesn't communicate and doesn't operate out in the world, then what's the purpose? However, it's painful to let go of them, and then just thinking of them in those terms as a commodity object is something that makes me cringe. But,
It
you know,
should.
so it's like, you know, because for me, there's greater reasons for making the work. You know, I feel it sounds cheesy, but just like a calling to make this work.
Yeah.
And so there's a sacred component to the practice and the process for me that I take seriously.
I think the good thing about that is that people who purchase your work, that resonates with them and they pick that up, and by default, the people who acquire your work really value it in a way that I would think would be would help that letting it go a little
I think
bit.
That's amazing when that happens.
Yeah.
No question.
Yeah. Any other questions for Kelly? All right. We will say thank you so much for sharing all that with us. And you can see the entire exhibition on our website. And thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you.